The following is a News Channel 8 special report.
Coverage in a special report from News Channel 8. President Obama will address the nation on his plan to combat Islamic State terrorists in Iraq and possibly Syria as well. Joining me now live on set, Tim Starks from CQ Roll Call to give us a political perspective. But first, retired Colonel Douglas Macgregor of the Macgregor Group. You've seen these stories all the time in your line of work. How did the president lay out his plan, and did he hit a home run?
Well, I didn't hear a plan. What I heard the president do was commit the United States and the American people to an open-ended campaign of counterterrorism in the Middle East, ostensibly on the side of the Shiite Arabs in southern Iraq and the Kurds in northern Iraq, supposedly with a coalition which he did not enumerate or explain. That we're going to do this until these organizations, ISIL, ISIS, whatever we're calling them, the Islamic State, disappears. So that's a pretty tall order for air power, and it assumes that we're going to have the cooperation of lots of people, many of whom are actually backing the Islamic State.
Even once they're gone, once ISIS, the Islamic State, Levant, L for Levant, if we call it Levant, then Iraq becomes Mesopotamia, so whatever. Right. But once they're gone, they can morph into something else.
Of course. And remember, their recruiting stations and their cash support, their monetary support, their supplies, come out of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. I mean, these are the states that are supposedly going to be part of this coalition. We know from the Secretary of Defense's meeting with the Turkish General Staff a couple of days ago, they made it very clear that they would participate, but within very specific parameters. In other words, there would be conditions under which they might participate. I think he's dressed this thing up to the best of his ability to be a strategic plan, but in reality, he is doing something in response to the decapitation of 2 American journalists on television.
Their videos sold the American public for support. Tim Starks from Roll Call, we've got this overwhelming majority of Americans who support doing something against the Islamic State. ISIS handed it to us with those videos. It's one thing to say, like, hashtag save the girls and now go after ISIS. It's another thing to actually make that a reality. Now, this story just in, a U.S. official says Saudi Arabia has agreed to open its bases for the training of moderate Syrian rebels as part of an effort to better equip them against the threat of the Islamic State militants. Where's everybody on Capitol Hill? It's midterm election time. I don't see a lot of politicians coming out saying, yeah, this is what we should do, because they're afraid of blowback if it doesn't work.
And they've been somewhat afraid of this situation pretty much from the start of when things started degenerating in Syria. You know, when the president came to them and said, would you please vote on allowing airstrikes? That was part of his fear of getting overly involved. And you saw that the Hill, other than a few lawmakers who were pushing the issue, other than one committee that did something on that proposal, they wanted to avoid it then. They've warmed up to it a little bit because of what you said, because of the decapitations that moved the public to a certain degree, and that in turn moved Congress. If the polling has changed a little bit. The last time I was here, we talked about this very issue of how national security wasn't playing real big in these elections. Well, the polling has shifted, and people are more interested now in doing something, like you said. And that in turn has made it so that Congress has been a little bit more interested in doing something, to the point that when they were going to vote today on a possible resolution to keep funding the government, when Obama came to them with a late request to say, help me put in this $500 million to arm the Syrian rebels more than we've done so far, the Hill said, okay, we'll consider this. So I think there's a little bit of the two sides moving toward each other politically, and part of that is driven by the public wanting to do something more than we've been doing.
One of the headlines coming from tonight's address is the president said he would take this fight to Syria if need be. Here's what he said.
I can announce that America will lead a broad coalition to roll back this terrorist threat. Our objective is clear. We will degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL through a comprehensive and sustained counterterrorism strategy. First, we will conduct a systematic campaign of airstrikes against these terrorists. Working with the Iraqi government, we will expand our efforts beyond protecting our own people and humanitarian missions so that we're hitting ISIL targets as Iraqi forces go on offense. Moreover, I've made it clear that we will hunt down terrorists who threaten our country wherever they are. That means I will not hesitate to take action against ISIL in Syria as well as Iraq.
Doug Macgregor, you're a decorated combat veteran. He talked about the government dealing with and working with the government of Iraq. There is no government there. That's one of the problems. And does it surprise you, or is it just one of the necessary evils that we've got to go into Syria?
No, it's not surprising, but it's incredibly dangerous. First of all, he talked about going back to Congress and saying, listen, I want you to arm and train these Sunni Muslim Arabs who are moderates. Well, here's something interesting for your viewers. Some of the Sunni Muslim Arabs who were moderates that we trained and equipped in Jordan are now fighting with ISIS in Iraq. This business of these are the good ones, these are the bad ones, these are moderate, these are immoderate, these kinds of things don't mean much. This is a very complex region. Everyone has an agenda. Their agenda is not our agenda. And when the president starts talking about expanding into Syria, he's now approaching the Turkish border. The Turks have very real, vital strategic interests in what happens in Syria. They want the removal of Assad and the Shiites. They are part of this Sunni coalition. So this is very problematic to expand this thing as he's talking about it. Sure, we can hit targets on the ground, but people on the ground are going to take advantage of our airstrikes. They're going to use our airstrikes for their own purposes that don't necessarily align with ours.
The worry is one day they're fighting for us, the next day they're fighting against us. So Osama bin Laden, wasn't he on our side at one time?
Of course. We thought he was.
Freedom fighters against the evil Soviet Empire. It's ironic that this comes on the eve of the 9/11 anniversary. Here's what the president said about 9/11.
My fellow Americans, we live in a time of great change. Tomorrow marks 13 years since our country was attacked. Next week marks 6 years since our economy suffered its worst setback since the Great Depression. Yet, despite these shocks, through the pain we felt and the grueling work required to bounce back, America is better positioned today to seize the future than any other nation on earth.
Tim Starks from Roll Call. Observers are telling me it's important that the president mention the economy, mention how well we're doing, because Wall Street is watching this closely. We don't want the markets to tank. They very well could take the wrong turn tomorrow just after the fair. Otherwise, some analysts are saying defense stocks are going to go up. Raytheon, for example, others involved with munitions and radar, it's going to be better business for them. What do you expect to hear from Capitol Hill and Wall Street, for that matter, in the next few days?
So Capitol Hill was, I think, being a little cautious about not wanting to get ahead of the president here in case the politics shifted. Talking to members of Congress today, a number of them were saying things like, well, let's hear what he wants to do first before they were willing to commit to any particular kind of action, including even things they've kind of proposed before. So they were playing a wait-and-see game, I think, to see how this speech went and what happened with the public. And then, of course, as far as the stock question, that's an interesting one. I think it'll depend on how much of a sense Wall Street gets that this is going to be a prolonged, as the Colonel said, a potentially open-ended, long-lasting war.
For example, it took the downing of the Malaysian airliner to send Wall Street tumbling for a couple of percentage points for the year, for a couple of months anyway. The beheadings of Foley and Sotloff, that galvanized the country, galvanized the world, Doug. But beyond that, what else do we have to worry about from ISIS? For example, there's thought that some are saying they could use biological weapons. Others are concerned, bringing up the drama issue in Mexico, that they could be trying to get through the U.S.-Mexico border.
Well, listen, we've already got Muslim terrorist cells inside the United States, Shiite and Sunni, that have walked into this country from Mexico. They're already here. So the notion that ISIS is somehow or another going to create something new is just utterly false. We've already got those problems. We've got the FBI fully engaged in tracking and watching these people. So if you defend the border, you can stop a lot of it, absolutely. And it's a lot cheaper to defend your border than it is to launch airstrikes all over the Middle East. But then you get into the immigration question. Are you going to control it? Are you going to enforce federal law? We don't even do that. These are fairly inexpensive ways of dealing with terrorism. But to go back to your point about biological issues, Ebola is spreading very rapidly in Central Africa. One person who happens to have Ebola, who manages to get into the country legally, poses an infinitely greater threat to the United States than anything happening in the Middle East.
There's been the controversy about boots on the ground. Whose boots are they going to be on the ground? General John Allen talked about that. Let's listen to what he said.
I think we need a comprehensive approach. Some of that's going to be special operators on the ground. I don't think necessarily we need maneuver forces. There's lots of people whose interests are vested in a positive outcome here. We need to build a coalition that can support this.
Tim Starks, how willing is Congress going to be to sit back and watch the president build this coalition? I know there are going to be a lot of people second-guessing tomorrow. We've got France, we've got, not too sure about Turkey. What's the political fallout going to be going forward?
So the coalition is going to be hard to manage, and we wrote about that today, in fact, that these countries have the Sunni allegiances that make it so they might not want to get too overly involved in fighting in a way that would benefit Shiites. So that's a potential problem that is going to be happening with the coalition. I think Congress is staying away from that. What they're going to be doing are things like talking about the border. There was a hearing today where they were discussing legislation to try to figure out a way to deal with the no-fly list, to bolster it against these potential terrorists, to deal with the border and help there. The other thing, though, is that some of these, even at these hearings today, there was a discussion that maybe they're not still the number one threat. To the homeland, that in fact even Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula still would be the number one threat that would be a potential strike within the homeland.
I appreciate getting your insight tonight. This has been a News Channel 8 special report. Thanks to our analyst, Tim Starks from CQ Roll Call, retired Colonel Douglas Macgregor of the Burke-Macgregor Group. I'm Morris Jones. Keep it here on News Channel 8. Toyota Sports Talk is next.